Oh wow. Oh wow. It's quite nasty. It's really, really nasty. Oh wow. Oil sitting on the top of the butterfly. The engine did turn. Great stuff. Oh wow. Hey guys, this is Spencer from Volimoto Customs, and this is my 2008 KTM SuperDuke 990. I've purchased this bike a few months ago with a known engine defect. The previous owner told me that the rear cylinder bottom gasket is leaking and that the bike can actually start, but it also smokes a tiny bit. So when I went to look at it, I fully expected to hear it run, but unfortunately when we tried to crank it, it could barely turn around. It sounded like the battery was very weak, but he told me he just recently also purchased a new battery, so it was a bit strange. But I traveled a long way and I saw some potential in this bike, so now it's back here in the garage on the bench and we can start looking into the issues. We're gonna start by draining the oil from the oil tank itself. All right. The first impression is that there's probably water in the oil because something very viscous hit my hand, and also there is some milky emulsion looking like stuff in there. It's also a known issue with these LC8 engines that the water pump fails, so water starts going into the oil. So we're gonna have to, of course, take a look at that, and let's see what other surprises await us on the way. And we have the fuel tank. I'm also going to drain the engine. Gonna be honest with you, I did not expect that there will be so much oil in here because I thought that most of it was actually inside the oil tank. I've emptied out this so we can drain the remaining of the oil. I've drained almost 8 liters of oil out of the oil tank and the engine. And the engine should take about 3 liters when it's fully filled, which is just pretty insane. So we're gonna have to see what's going on here. Oh wow. This is a symptom if there was water in the engine, and so it couldn't suck any oil through the filter itself, so it just sucked it in, and yeah, this is completely destroyed. The water really smells very bad, to be honest. I wonder when was the last time it was replaced. There's actually oil sitting on top of the butterfly. I think that's pretty insane. We still have a few things to check, and the next one would be taking out the spark plugs, because with all that oil in the engine, there's a potential that there is actually some oil in the cylinders, and it might cause the engine to be very difficult to turn, and that could have caused the problems with our starter and, you know, the issues regarding starting up. We do have a pretty serious problem. As you can see here, part of the spark plug is broken off and is now inside the engine. Probably embedded itself into the piston if we're lucky. That's a fun one. Finding out that part of the spark plug is broken off inside the engine is pretty scary. So let's continue getting off the cooler and the oil tank and get the spark plug out from the other cylinder as well. Alright, you can see that it is intact, but there was actually a big droplet of oil. So pretty sure that the cylinder is filled with oil, and that's no surprise with the amount that was in there. And it's also no surprise the engine could not turn around by the starter motor with a weak battery. At this point, I want to try to turn around the engine with the plugs out, and we are going to put a battery directly onto the starter motor and see what happens. The engine did turn, and it has sprayed out a very large amount of oil everywhere. So yeah, I definitely should have put a piece of cloth so I don't get oil over everything. I'm going to try again. Well, it looks like most of the oil had been squeezed out in the first run, because there's not really much on the paper. But the engine turns around great, so that's a good start. So it's a new day. I've assembled some of the things again, and we are going to do a compression test. I've got a new oil filter, we've got some new oil. We're gonna flush the system and also fill the coolant up. And we are going to attempt to start the bike after we've assembled everything enough. So let's proceed with the compression test and see how we're doing. I've measured 225, let's reset it, and measure the rear cylinder as well. I did measure a significantly smaller number here. It's about 185-ish, I'd say. But this number alone would be perfect. And the reason could be for the difference between the front and rear cylinder is that there was so much oil in the front cylinder. So there's most likely a better seal, just simply due to the oil. So I would say this is acceptable for now, and we're gonna have to run the bike for a bit, and then probably I will measure the compression once more. Before I can fill up the tank again with some fresh oil, I of course also need to check the filter in the oil tank itself, because there is a pre-filter here, and there's also an oil screen on the other side of the engine. Wow, it's quite nasty. It's really nasty. Seeing the stuff that was in here, I'm gonna take the oil tank off and I'm gonna try to properly clean it. And it doesn't look okay. I was gonna say it doesn't look too bad, but it is also pretty nasty, as you can see. Let's put this back in. There is a mark where it says top that needs to be going in the correct way. I'm gonna put in some new spark plugs. Next up is putting the oil tank back. I have completely cleaned this out. There was a little bit of leftover emulsion inside, so I used the parts cleaner and I flushed it multiple times, and then I have flushed it with some oil to actually remove the leftover parts cleaner, and now it is ready to be put back and ready to be filled up with some fresh oil. Let's put in one more bolt. Goes right in here. We have about 2.8 liters in there. The last thing I need to do is actually connect the battery, and then we're gonna lower the bike and put on the ignition and hit the starter button. We're gonna roll her outside and we're gonna start her up again. I'm gonna put her back on the stand and figure out what else needs to be fixed. There is already some waving action happening on the filter, even though it's been very short amount of time. So after all this, of course, I decided to take the engine out, and we are going to do a top end rebuild, and we're gonna also maybe split the cases and check the oil pump and replace everything necessary. So we got the engine out. I've cleaned it up a little bit and I removed the starter and also the water hoses. So next step is taking the valve covers off so we can turn the engine to top dead center and start taking everything apart. So to make sure that the rear cylinder doesn't move out from top dead center, there is a special KTM tool. It's basically just a bolt with a pointy end you can install into the casing. I've made this out of a threaded rod and I have installed it now, so the crankshaft is locked. We have the rear cylinder top dead center and we can measure the valve clearances. So 030 is a go on both. It's a very tight fit. Well, it's pretty much on spec, to be fair with you, because 030 is a very tight fit in there and 035 will not go. So let's check the intake side, which should be 010 to 015. All right, we are going to go start with 015. And see how we go from there. So intake side 015. 015 is no-go on one side and it is a go on the other side. So of course we've also got the cam chain tensioner that we need to measure, 7.2 millimeters. So this should be between 5 and 10, so that's okay. There are two little pinions that are holding. That gunk from the oil and water mixture is just everywhere, and it's absolutely obvious that the seal had failed because there's water here on the inside, and it looks like the PO has not noticed it on time, and this is the result we're dealing with right now. Slightly more encouraging from the other side. There is still a bit of gunk in here as well, but it's also a lot more viscous rather than on the other side, where on the casing it really has settled into these big chunks. So I'm still hopeful that when we split the halves we'll not find much of that inside the engine, but we'll never know until we actually see it. So let's continue the work. Really good news, the journals on the camshafts are looking really nice, and there's absolutely no scoring or evident wear on them. I'm very happy to see that, and since we have got everything marked down, we are actually ready to remove the camshafts themselves. The buckets are looking good. I was a little bit worried initially because of the wear on these cams, but my dad looked at it and he said it's not too bad. He wouldn't really change them right now, and I trust his opinion very much, so we're gonna be reusing these.
Well guys, the first good news is that the surface between the cylinder and the case looks perfect. Pull this a bit further up. So on first glance, looking inside the engine, it's looking good. The rings don't look too bad on the first glance, and the piston itself also looks fairly okay, other than some small scoring on the skirts. The cylinder wall looks pretty good, and the valves themselves also. Quite happy to see that there are not really any issues. So we can continue removing the front cylinder, and hopefully we find similar or better condition in there. We've got the front cylinder on top dead center now as well, and the engine locked. We are ready to take our measurements for the valve clearances on the front as well, and also of course the chain tensioner for the cam. We have an 03 that we should be okay with on the exhaust side, and that is a tight fit, but it's a go. 010 is a good go, no problems. And 015 is not a go on one side and is not a go on the other side. So actually these are quite well in spec, no problems there. Cylinder wall is looking okay, and valves are looking fine as well. I don't think there's too much to worry here on this side either.
So we finally split the engine in half. The crankshaft looks pretty nice. We're of course gonna measure the journals, but there's no scoring. They're in very, very nice condition, so I'm not too worried there. The main bearings look pretty fine. There is, I think, just the normal wear on them, but we ought to measure those as well. The cylinder looks totally fine. There's absolutely no shoulder or anything, so that's really good news. We're gonna refresh the heads a bit, replace the valve shaft seals, and lap them in again. Hopefully, of course, if they measure right. But based on everything we've seen, I'm pretty sure they're okay. So everything's just gonna get a good cleaning, and it can all start going back together. You can see here the matte gray bar that's developing where the contact surfaces are mating, and you can also see here on the valve that it's starting to clean up. There's still a few spots, for example this area here, where I'm 100% sure that it doesn't just seal yet, and maybe here. So we're gonna go one more round, and then afterwards we're gonna check with some fuel, just by holding the valves in, and some dry paper, and see if it seals properly. It's important that the shaft is oiled up every time that it's inserted, so we make sure that we don't do any damage in the process of the lapping. So the way I do this check is I have dried and cleaned the surfaces that mate, and then I'm gonna take a piece of clean and dry paper. I'm gonna put that onto the valve and hold the valve in just by hand, not too strong. And then what we're gonna do is we are going to inject some fuel into the port, the exhaust port here. Not too much, just so that there's enough to completely get around the valve seat. And I'm going to hold the valve in and just leave it here for 10 seconds. And afterwards, I'm just gonna dump the fuel back through the port, just onto this piece of paper and or cloth, and then we lift up the paper, and I can see that actually this seals perfectly because there's not a drop of petrol or anything that has come through. It's completely dry around. I've gone over and cleaned the cases and then checked all the bearings, and actually I need to replace all the bearings, all the roller bearings inside the case. The main bearing for the crankshaft is actually in perfect condition. I'm super happy about that because I didn't really want to replace them because they look fine. You can see of course some wear on them, but After measuring, I have confirmed that they're good. So I've also measured up the oil pump, and they are actually also perfectly within specification. So I don't need to replace those. Although I have found that the spring and the piston for the oil bypass both need replacement. The piston is quite beaten up, and the spring is well below the minimum length limit set by the factory. We need to heat up the cases to 150 degrees in an oven. I just took the new bearings out from the freezer. They've been in there for 3 days and the case should be warm enough now. Let's get it out of the oven and see if maybe we're lucky to just be able to pop in these. Let's just see if this has worked. All right, I think that bearing is properly seated. All right, that definitely had seated properly, just from the sound of it. It's good. Beautiful. I think we've arrived. Yeah, it has seated up properly. And then we have this small bearing, which we'll need to pop in here on the top. I'm just gonna put my glove in behind here because I don't want to burn myself. All right, that has seated up as well. Well, we have all the new bearings in here. Could have been a little bit faster, so they were still just straight out of the freezer, but the freezer is upstairs, so I had to run up and bring it down. But we are actually good with everything here, and the bearings are in the case. Of course, it was important that I was prepared with all the tools to drive them home. And yeah, one side is done. Let's heat up the other one and put the new bearings in that one as well. While we're waiting for the other side of the engine case to heat up, I'm going to put in the new seals. That was very smooth. Almost went all the way down before I even had to do anything. One in. We actually have all the new bearings in the case now, which is fantastic. Now I just need to put in all the retention bolts with some Loctite and we can start assembling the engine. When I was taking the engine out, I noticed that the swing arm pivots were not really easy to turn by hand, which is definitely not a sign you want to have. So I decided to remove the swing arm, and as you can see, there is quite a lot of corrosion inside the needle bearing, and it is completely shut. So I'm gonna be replacing those before I put back the engine, because of course the pivot bolt for the swing arm is also one of the mounting points for the engine. So after all that work we've done, we finally arrived to the time to start her up for the first time, and I'm super excited. We of course still have a couple fairings and seat, etc. to put on, but for now I would just like to run her for 30 seconds and just see that everything is looking okay. I expect quite a bit of smoke because the catalyzer is still filled with oil from running it the previous time, but hopefully everything will be fine other than that. So let's give it a crank. We have the oil pressure light still on, so that worries me a little bit, but I'm gonna have to just double check that everything is properly connected and all those things. And we didn't hear any chain rattle, so that means that there is probably oil pressure, but maybe maybe the pressure sensor is not sensing it just yet. Seeing that the oil level didn't drop in the oil tank, I suspected that there is actually no oil pressure and the gauge was correct. So I decided to backtrack my work, and I had realized I made a mistake when assembling the pressure relief valve in the housing of the oil pump. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of the actual fix itself, but it involved getting the clutch cover off, getting the clutch basket out, and right under sits the housing for the pressure pump, and in it sits the pressure relief valve, which I needed to turn around. After the fix, the oil pressure immediately built up, and I even verified with the gauge, and I got 3 bars at cold at idle, and 3.5 bars, so pressure relief valve coming into action at any blip of the throttle. So issue was resolved and I could move on. Being this the very first KTM engine, and for that matter the very first dry sump engine I've worked on, I definitely learned quite a bit in the process. There were some small mistakes I made, and if I were to do it again, I would probably do a couple things slightly differently. But overall this was a really fun project, and I'm very happy that I undertook it. And of course I'm very glad that I could take you guys along in the process. There's one thing I will definitely say I should have done differently. I should have replaced the timing chain and the guide rails for those, as well as the timing chain tensioner, while the engine was out of the bike and on the workbench, because there is a little bit of timing chain noise and it really annoys me. So I am going to undertake that process. And that means that now I have to do all that with the engine in the bike. But oh well, we're gonna do it anyway. So if you guys wanna come along for the ride, let me know in the comments below what sort of format video we want to get out of that, and I can film something for you. This is it for now. See you in the next one.